She walked out of the Colville National Forest on a Tuesday morning in June of 1994, crossed through the tree line at the back of our north pasture and set something down at our fence post. Then she stepped back. 3 full steps, and she stood there and watched our house. I was at the kitchen window when it happened, coffee in my hand, still in my robe, watching the cattle, because that is what you do at 5:30 in the morning on a cattle ranch in northeastern Washington. You watch, you count, you note what is wrong before it has time to become anything worse. What I saw that morning was wrong in every way I knew how to measure it, and it took me a long time to understand that it was also the most right thing I had ever witnessed. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from and if you've had an encounter like this. My name is Donna Prewitt. I'm 70 years old, and I have lived my entire adult life on a cattle ranch in Ferry County, Washington, in the Kettle River Range country east of Republic. Dale, my husband, was born on this land. His parents ran cattle here before us, and before them, his grandfather had run a small timber operation on the same 4,300 acres before the economics of small-scale logging made that impractical. We converted to a cow-calf operation in the early 1980s. At our peak, we were running about 280 head of Angus cross on a combination of deeded land and a grazing lease in the Colville National Forest. Dale passed away in January of 2019. Lung cancer, caught late. He was 67. I am telling you that not because it is the center of this story, but because this story belongs to both of us, and he is not here to tell his half, and so I am telling it for him too. The property sits at around 2,800 feet elevation on the eastern slope of the Kettle Range. The Sampoil River runs about 4 miles to our east, and the Kettle River watershed begins on the other side of the ridge to our west. If you have never been to that corner of Washington, it is not what most people picture when they think of the state. There are no mountains visible from our valley in the dramatic, snow-capped sense. The landscape is rolling highlands, dense forest of ponderosa pine and western larch and Douglas fir on the slopes, and in the valley bottoms, meadows and creek drainages that fill with bunch grass and wild rye in the summer. It is beautiful in the manner of places that have not been groomed for visitors. Rough beautiful, honest beautiful. The back of our north pasture runs up to a tree line about 300 yards from the house. Beyond that tree line, the Colville National Forest begins without ceremony. No sign, no fence from our boundary into the National Forest land. Just our 4-wire fence where our deeded land ends, and then the timber, and then more timber, and then eventually the crest of the Kettle Range. We bordered National Forest on 2 sides. In any given week, black bear crossed our fence line multiple times. Mountain lion sign was common in the upper pastures in winter. Elk moved through in the fall, and during their migrations, they could push through a fence like it was made of paper. I have been ranching long enough that none of that bothered me. Wildlife was part of the operation. You accounted for it like weather. What had been coming out of that forest for the 3 years before June of 1994 was not any of those things. It started in the summer of 1991. Kevin was 13 that year, and Wayne was 10, and Dale and I were in the middle of the kind of summer that defines what ranching actually is, which is not the romantic version people imagine, but a long sequence of problems to solve before they compound into disasters. We had a drainage issue in the South Meadow that was drowning the bunchgrass. We had a bull with a lame foreleg that our veterinarian Tom Garfield out of Republic had been treating for 2 weeks without the improvement we needed. And we had a problem with the north fence that I kept putting off addressing because there were 3 other problems in front of it in the queue. The north fence problem was this: a force was pushing on it, not breaking through it, just pushing, bending the wire, leaning on the top strand hard enough that the staples were pulling from the posts in a section that ran about 60 feet along the upper edge of the north pasture. I had seen elk damage and bear damage and deer damage and cattle damage, and none of them looked quite like this. Elk hit a fence with their chest and pushed through with force. Bear tend to go under or over. Whatever was pushing on our north fence was leaning against it with what must have been considerable steady weight, bending the wire uniformly across those 60 feet in a way that suggested a large weight pressing against it, not moving through it. Dale looked at it and thought it was elk. I told him I had never seen elk damage that looked exactly like that. He agreed it was different, but held that elk were the most likely explanation, and we needed to replace the staples either way. So we replaced the staples. By the following week, the same section was bent again. That was August of 1991. We went through that cycle 3 more times before the first frost, replacing staples, coming back to find them pulled again, and debating what was responsible. Dale was consistent in his theory. Elk, probably a group of them, using that section of fence as a meeting point or a rubbing post. I was less convinced, but I did not have a better explanation to offer, and I had learned in 19 years of marriage to Dale Prewitt that he was right often enough to deserve the benefit of the doubt. The first time I heard the sounds was that October. October in the Kettle Range comes in cold and fast, the larch going gold before anything else, and the ponderosa holding its green longer than you expect, and the nights dropping below freezing while the afternoons still hold some warmth. I sleep lightly, always have. Ranching trains it into you. You listen at night as you watch in the morning, always monitoring the ambient sound of the property for anything that does not belong. Coyotes howl, and you recognize their pattern. The cattle settle into their sounds. The horses we kept then had their own nighttime vocabulary. You learn the baseline, and when a sound falls off the baseline, your body registers it before your brain does. What I heard that first night was low, much lower than anything I associated with the local wildlife. A deep, sustained vocalization that came from somewhere north of the house, from the direction of the tree line. It lasted maybe 8 or 10 seconds, then stopped. I lay in the dark and waited for it to repeat. It did about 2 minutes later, slightly different in pitch, shorter in duration, then a third time even shorter, almost like a trailing off, then nothing.
Quick thing before we get into it. I have a book coming out. It's called the Bigfoot Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. It's kind of my baby. So if you want to check it out, link's down below. And let's get you back to the video.
Dale had not woken. I did not wake him. I lay there listening to the silence that followed and trying to place what I had heard inside my existing catalog of sounds for that country. Nothing fit. Not coyotes, not the low hoot of a great horned owl, not the scream of a mountain lion, which I had heard twice in my years there and which, once heard, is not forgotten. Not an elk bugle. This was something deeper than any of those. Something that you felt in the chest cavity rather than just the ears. Something that arrived not just as a sound but as a presence, a reminder that the darkness outside the walls of that house was very large and not empty. I did not tell Dale about it the next morning. I filed it away and went on with my day. Over the following 3 weeks, I heard the sounds 4 more times. Always at night, always from the north, always in that same low-frequency range. The pattern was irregular enough that I could not predict it. It might go 6 nights without occurring, and then I would hear it 2 nights in a row. But the quality of it was consistent, deep, tonal, more complex than a single pitch. There were variations within it that I struggled to describe even to myself. Not quite musical, not quite mechanical, partway between. Dale finally heard it in mid-November, a night when the temperature had dropped to around 12 degrees and the forest was so quiet in the cold that the sound carried to the house with unusual clarity. He came fully awake, as he always did, immediately and without confusion, sat up in bed and turned his head toward the north window. We listened together through 2 full repetitions. When the silence returned, he told me quietly that he had never heard that before. I told him I had, 5 or 6 times in the past month. He asked me why I hadn't told him. I told him I didn't know what to say. We got up. Dale put on his coat and boots over his long underwear, took the rifle from the rack in the entryway, and went out to the porch. I watched from the window. He stood in the cold for about 20 minutes, listening, looking north. The sounds did not repeat. He came back inside and offered wolves as an explanation that there were confirmed wolf packs in the Kettle Range by then. I told him it didn't sound like any wolf vocalization I had heard on the radio programs about wolf recovery, and that I had lived next to wolf country my whole adult life. He agreed. He promised to ask around in town. He did ask around. He talked to our nearest neighbor, Carl Briggs, who ran cattle about 1.5 miles west of us up Scatter Creek. Carl had heard the same sound twice that fall and written it off as a coyote with an unusual call. He talked to a man at the Republic Feed store who said there had been some unusual wildlife reports from the Kettle Range country that year. Nothing specific, just a general sense among the people who spent time in those mountains that a shift had occurred. And he talked to Tom Garfield, our vet, who was also an avid hunter and knew the Colville National Forest as well as anyone in Ferry County. Tom had no idea what was making those sounds, but he had been running trail cameras in the national forest above our property that fall and had gotten some footage he couldn't quite explain, a blurred shape at the edge of a clearing that he couldn't match to any animal he knew. The image wasn't clear enough to mean anything, and he had filed it under inconclusive. The sound of a cattleman saying inconclusive about a wildlife trail camera is not a thing you hear often. Tom Garfield was careful with his words, and the fact that he used that one told me the shape on his camera had been enough to stop him short of an explanation. That winter, things were quiet. The sounds stopped around the time the deep snow came in December, and through January and February and most of March. The north pasture and the tree line beyond it were silent in the ordinary ways that deep winter silences things. The fence stayed in order, the cattle grazed without unusual agitation. I stopped listening with the particular attentiveness I had developed in the fall and let the winter routine close over the question as snow closes over a fence post. Still there, just not visible. April brought the thaw, and with it a change. Kevin found the tracks on a Tuesday afternoon when he was riding the fence line, checking for winter damage. He was 14 by then, and like any boy raised on a ranch, he had been doing fence work on horseback since he was 10. He came back to the barn fast, the horse's movement telling me the horse's speed told me before Kevin's expression did. He'd found tracks in the soft ground along the upper section of the north fence, and that they were not deer tracks and not bear tracks and not anything he had ever seen, and that his horse had refused to go near them. I drove the truck up. The ground along that section of fence had thawed enough to take an impression, and the mud between the last of the snowbanks held prints clearly. I crouched down and looked at them for a long time. They were bipedal, human-shaped in the sense that they had a heel and a ball and toes, 5 of them clear in the mud, but the dimensions were wrong for any human being I had ever heard of. The length was close to 17 inches. The width across the ball was nearly 8 inches. The toe impressions were deep and evenly spaced, with no indication of a boot or any kind of footwear. Whatever had made these tracks had been barefoot in April in northeastern Washington, in ground that still had snow at its margins. Kevin asked me what they were. I told him I didn't know. He asked if they were from a person. I told him I didn't think so. He asked what else could make a print that big walking on 2 feet. I told him I didn't know. I took photographs with the camera we kept in the truck glove box for documenting livestock injuries and fence damage. I got down close and used my hand for scale, my hand which spans about 7.5 inches across the knuckles, beside a print that was wider than my hand is long. I photographed the stride pattern which showed a step length of about 5 feet between prints, which on a bipedal animal suggested either an extremely tall individual or one with a gait that placed more weight on reach than on stride. The prints led north from the fence line toward the timber. They did not come back through the fence or along any other section of fence that Kevin and I walked that afternoon. I drove to Republic and bought 4 more boxes of film. If whatever this was came back, I intended to have enough film to document it properly. Dale came out and looked at the track site that evening. He was quiet for a long time. He measured the print length with his tape measure, which he carried in his jacket pocket out of habit. He measured the stride. He looked at the compression in the mud from whatever weight had been walking there. Then he said, "Donna, that print is deeper than mine, and I weigh 220. He pressed his own boot into the soft mud beside one of the prints. His boot made a depression about 1/3 of an inch deep. The unknown print was over an inch deep. Whatever this is, he said, it weighs considerably more than 220 pounds. We stood there in the late April light with the forest at our backs and the cattle visible in the lower pasture and the mountains rising behind the tree line. And we did not say the word that was sitting between us. Not that evening. Dale was not a man who leaped to conclusions, and the word felt like a conclusion. It felt like the word you used when all the ordinary explanations had run out, and Dale was not ready to let go of ordinary explanations yet. I was getting there faster than he was. The fence pushing resumed in May. Same section, same pattern, the top wire bent and the staples working loose from the post. But now the tracks were there alongside it in the soft ground at the base of the post, and the impressions told a different story than elk. They told the story of a presence standing at the fence for a period of time, shifting its weight, placing its hands or forearms on the top wire. The indentations at the base of the fence posts were deep, foot-shaped, and deep enough to suggest the weight pressing there was substantial. And there was a smell. I do not know how to describe this smell to someone who has not encountered it, but I will try because it is important. It was not the smell of a dirty animal. It was not the smell of decay or sickness. It was heavy, musky, layered, like a big animal smells when it is warm and close, but amplified to a degree that stopped you short. An intensity of living smell, old wood and earth, and a darker note beneath both, like the inside of a place that has been sheltered for a long time. I smelled it first on a windless morning in late May when I walked up to check the fence, and the odor hit me at about 40 feet and did not diminish as I approached. It was strongest in the section where the fence damage was worst. It faded over the course of the morning as the day heated up and the breeze came in from the west. I mentioned the smell to Tom Garfield when I ran into him at the feed store in Republic in early June. Tom knew the smell. He had encountered it twice in the Colville National Forest in the past 5 years, once while hunting and once while checking his trail cameras. The second time he had been sitting in a blind about 20 yards from his camera setup, and the smell had arrived before he heard or saw anything, and then he had caught movement in the timber about 100 yards away that he had not been able to resolve into any known animal shape before it was gone. The smell was what told him the trail camera image from the previous fall was not an error. He looked at me directly. Donna, whatever is coming to your fence line has been in my forest for at least 5 years. Whatever. We were still saying whatever. By the middle of June 1991, I had seen the fence pushed 3 times and found tracks twice more. The sounds at night were returning with the warm weather 2 or 3 times a week, always from the north, always that same low, sustained pattern. Kevin had heard them now and was asking questions I could not fully answer. Wayne, who was 10, had heard them once and had come to our room scared, and Dale had sat with him and told him it was probably wolves, which was technically possible in Kettle Range country and which was also not what it was. And then, on the 23rd of June, 1991, at about 6 in the evening with the sun still well up and the cattle in the lower pasture and Kevin helping Dale repair a section of south fence, I looked out the kitchen window and saw it for the first time. It was at the north fence, standing beside the fence post that marked the corner of the section where the wire had been pushed so many times, standing upright on 2 legs, and it was enormous. My first thought was that it was a person. A very large person, but the proportions were wrong before my brain finished processing the first impression. The shoulders were too wide, the arms were too long, the torso was too deep, and it was covered in hair, dense, dark, chestnut brown hair that covered everything except the face, which I could not fully make out at 300 yards. It was facing the house, it was watching. I did not move from the window. I was afraid that if I moved, it would go. I was afraid that if I blinked for too long, it would be gone when I opened my eyes. I stood at the kitchen sink with both hands gripping the counter's edge, and I looked at the thing at my north fence, and I felt something that was not fear. Not exactly. It was more like the feeling you get when you are reading a word you have never seen before and suddenly you know how to pronounce it. Recognition before understanding. A word for something your brain has always had room for but never needed to use until now. It stood at the fence for what I measured as 4 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the kitchen wall and counted because I needed something specific to hold on to, something measurable. 4 minutes at 300 yards in full evening light, standing still, watching my house. Then it turned, and what I saw in the turning was its back, and the back was as broad as a barn door, and the movement as it turned was fluid and unhurried, and entirely unlike any movement I had ever associated with the word bear or elk or wolf or any animal I had spent my life living alongside. It walked back toward the tree line. It walked on 2 legs with a gait that was different from a human walk in ways I struggled to put precisely into language. Longer, lower, with the weight carried differently through the hips as if the body above was heavier than what a human skeleton was built to hold. It reached the tree line and walked into the timber without hesitating, without looking back, and the forest closed behind it as if it had swallowed something whole. I stood at my kitchen window for a long time after it was gone. The clock said it was 6:22. I had a pot of water on the stove that had long since boiled down to nothing. My hands were still gripping the counter. The cattle in the lower pasture were calm, which struck me as significant. Whatever their instincts told them about what was standing at the north fence, it had not been the kind of alarm that sent them running. They had been aware of it. I had seen a few of them turn toward the north in the minutes before I noticed the figure myself. But they had not panicked. I went to the back door and looked north. The tree line was solid and undisturbed. The fence wire was bent in the familiar way. The cattle were drifting toward the water tank. The evening was completely ordinary, except that 30 minutes earlier a figure I had no adequate name for had been standing at my fence and looking at my house, and now I had to figure out what to do about that. I waited until the boys were in their rooms that night before I told Dale. I told him what I had seen, describing it as precisely as I could. He asked me how far away. I told him 300 yards. He asked me how long I had watched, 4 minutes. He asked me what I thought it was. I told him I thought it was what we had both been not saying for the better part of a year. He was quiet for a while. He refilled his coffee cup, which was a thing he did when he needed to do something with his hands. Then he said, "Are you certain?" I told him I was as certain as I had been about anything I had ever seen, and that I had been watching animals in this landscape for 19 years, and I knew what I was looking at when I looked at one. He nodded. He sat at the table for a long time. Then he said what I have turned over many times since. "Then we need to decide what we plan to do about it. Not what it was, not whether it was real." He accepted it as Dale accepted most things, without drama, without panic. He went straight to the practical question. What do we do? We talked for 2 hours that night. What Dale wanted to know was whether it posed a danger to us or to the cattle. My answer to both was no, based on what I had observed over the past year. Whatever had been pushing on the north fence and walking the perimeter of our property had not interfered with the cattle in any direct way. We had not lost any animals to predation. The cattle were aware of the presence, that was clear, but their response was watchfulness, not flight, and cattle in the presence of a predator they perceive as an active threat do not watch calmly. They move. The thing at our fence had not triggered that response. Dale said that as long as it wasn't taking cattle and wasn't approaching the house, he was willing to wait and see. That seemed like the sensible response to a thing that had been there for at least a year without causing direct harm. I agreed. But there was another conversation nested inside that one, and we both knew it, about the boys. Kevin was old enough to understand that an unusual thing was occurring on our property, and he had already asked direct questions. Wayne was younger, and we had been managing his awareness carefully, but a 10-year-old on a cattle ranch is not sheltered from the realities of the land. And Wayne was sharp enough that the gap between what he was observing and what we were telling him was going to close soon. Dale felt we should tell Kevin the truth, or as much of the truth as we had at that point. Kevin had the right to know what was on the property, both for his own safety and because he was working that fence line regularly and might encounter signs or more. We agreed that Kevin should be told in straightforward terms. A large bipedal presence was using the area around the north fence. We did not know what it was, and until we knew more, the protocol was to observe and document but not approach and not confront. Kevin took this with the seriousness of a boy who had grown up outdoors and understood that the land held things you needed to respect before you could understand them. He asked his father directly whether it was what people called Bigfoot. Dale told him that was the word people used when they didn't have a better one. Kevin nodded. He asked if it was dangerous. Dale said he didn't think so, but that we were going to be careful until we knew more. Kevin asked if he could set up his camera at the north fence. Dale said yes with conditions. Wayne was told there was a large animal that might be a bear-wolf hybrid using our tree line, which was not a real thing but was close enough to true that it would account for the sounds and the tracks and the fence damage without requiring a conversation we were not ready to have with a 10-year-old. The summer of 1991 moved into fall and then into winter, and the presence at the north fence continued. Kevin's camera, a 35mm that he loaded with film and rigged to a post with a motion trigger he and Dale built from parts at the hardware store in Republic, caught something in early September, not a clear photograph. The light was low and the figure was moving, and what the image showed was a dark shape, upright, caught in partial profile at about 30 yards from the camera, blurred by motion. The proportions were clear even in a blurred image. Wide shoulders, long arms, far too tall and far too broad for any human being. Kevin brought the print to the kitchen table, and the four of us stood around it, all three of us who knew what we were looking for, and nobody spoke for a long time. Dale studied the image as he studied everything, with patience and without projecting. Well, now we know we're not imagining it. Kevin asked if we should tell someone. Not yet, Dale said. I agreed with him, though, for reasons I was still working out. A protective awareness was already moving through me about the thing at our fence line, and I could not entirely explain why. It had not harmed us. It had been consistent in its behavior and careful in its distance. There was a quality to its presence on our property that did not feel aggressive or predatory. It felt curious, and curiosity in a living thing, even one you cannot categorize, does not inspire me to reach for a phone or call a government agency. It inspires me to watch more carefully and make more room. The next 3 years were a kind of education, not a formal one. Nobody sat me down and explained anything. I learned, as you learn anything, about an animal that does not want to be studied, through patience and accumulation and a willingness to revise what you thought you understood. By the end of 1991, I had established several things I was confident about. There was one large individual, the one I had first seen clearly in June, and possibly a second, smaller one that I caught at the edge of my vision twice in the fall and once in winter. The large one appeared to be female based on what I could observe of the chest and hip structure in the clear sighting, and on a quality of caution in the approach patterns that I associated, however, imprecisely, with protectiveness rather than territorial dominance. The second, smaller one I saw less often and always in the company of the larger one. I began to think of them as a pair, though whether that pair was mother and offspring, mated pair, or something else entirely I could not say with any confidence. By the end of 1992, I knew their patterns. The large one came to the north fence most reliably in the hour around dawn and the hour around dusk. She did not come every day. In full summer, when the days were longest, the visits were less frequent. In early fall, when the light shifted and the temperature dropped, they became more regular. I began to suspect the fence line visits were partly about the water. We had a stock pond in the north pasture, not visible from our house, about 150 yards from the tree line, and the ground around it stayed soft and wet through the summer. If she was using the forest and adjacent areas as a home range, the stock pond was the closest reliable surface water to the National Forest boundary. I did not verify this by stationing myself at the pond. That felt like an intrusion I was not ready to make, and I had a growing sense, based on nothing I could entirely articulate, that maintaining a respectful distance was part of an arrangement we had arrived at without negotiating. She came to the fence line. I watched from the house. The cattle grazed between us. The land held us all without requiring us to resolve our coexistence into something it was not yet. In 1993, I began leaving things at the fence post nearest to where she most often stood, nothing calculated, nothing exotic, a handful of dried apples from our storage cellar, a few pieces of the smoked venison Dale put up every fall, later over the winter, some dried corn from the last of our sweet corn harvest. I am not sure what I expected. What happened was that the food was gone by the following morning every time without exception, and in its place I sometimes found things. A pine cone that had been worked open to the seeds with a precision I could not replicate with my own fingers. A flat stone river smooth that had no practical reason to be placed there. Once a branch about 3 feet long that had been stripped of its bark and had a rough groove worn into one end in a way that looked purposeful. I took the branch inside and looked at it for a long time. I am not an expert in any of this. I am a cattle rancher from northeastern Washington who has never been to a museum of natural history or read an academic paper about anything. But I have spent 50 years working with my hands and understanding tools and their purposes, and that groove in the end of the branch had been made by pressure over time, by a hand using the end of it repeatedly for a purpose that had worn a channel in the wood. It looked like a digging tool. It looked like a tool. I put it on the kitchen windowsill where I could look at it while I was working. Dale saw it that evening and asked where it had come from. I told him. He picked it up and turned it in his hands, looked at the groove, ran his thumb along it. He set it down. A minute of silence. She left that for you. Not it. Not the animal. She. It was the first time either of us had used a gendered pronoun, and the word changed a shift in the conversation without either of us acknowledging it directly. 1993 was also the year Wayne turned 12 and started asking questions we could no longer answer with the bear-wolf hybrid explanation. He had found a set of tracks himself, coming home from the school bus stop down the county road in October, prints in the soft shoulder of the road that he recognized immediately were not bear and were not human. He came in the door with the look on his face that children get when they realize an adult has been managing their reality, and he set his backpack down on the kitchen floor. "Mama, those aren't bear tracks?" I told him to sit down. I told him what his father and I had been observing for the past 2.5 years. I told him it carefully and without embellishment, as you tell a child a thing that is going to require them to expand their understanding of the world. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked if it was a Bigfoot. That was the word most people used. He asked if it was scary, not so far, and that we had found no reason to be afraid of it. He asked if he could see it. I said maybe if he was patient and quiet and willing to spend a lot of early mornings at the kitchen window. He took that seriously. Wayne was always the more patient of my two boys, the one who could sit still for what he cared about. For the rest of that fall and into winter, he would get up before 5 and sit at the kitchen table with a mug of hot chocolate and watch the north pasture until school time. He saw her twice before Christmas. Both times he came and got me without speaking, and we stood together at the window and watched, and when she was gone he would turn and look at me with an expression I have never been able to fully describe. Not surprise, not fear. Wonder held very still like water cupped in your hands. And then came June of 1994. The spring of that year had been different from the previous two. The visits to the fence line were more frequent, which I had noticed but not immediately understood. She was coming every morning now, not just in the pre-dawn, but well into the early light, staying longer than she usually did. The small one, the companion I had been watching at a distance for 2 years and had gradually come to believe was an older juvenile, was less often present. She was coming alone mostly, and her behavior at the fence had changed. Instead of the usual standing and watching, she was moving along the fence line, back and forth, in the same section. Pacing was the word that came to mind, though I wanted to be careful about projecting human behaviors onto something I didn't understand. But the movement pattern was not foraging. It was not investigative, not the searching quality her movements had when she was sampling the air or examining an object on the ground. It had a quality of restlessness I had not seen in her before, and it pulled at a place in me that recognized restlessness even at 300 yards. I mentioned the change to Dale in early May. He had noticed it too. He thought the pattern might be related to the season. Animals behave differently in spring, and whatever her situation in the forest was, the warmer months might shift her in ways we couldn't predict. I agreed but kept watching. In late May, I noticed a change I had not seen before. She was moving differently, not in her behavior at the fence, but in the way she was carrying herself. Through the binoculars I had taken to keeping on the kitchen windowsill, I could see that her gait was slightly different, her body held at a different angle than her usual posture, and her chest was different. I am a woman who has calved cattle for 40 years. I know what a nursing female looks like from a distance, the changed posture, the way the body adjusts to weight it is managing differently. I set down the binoculars and I stood at the window, and I understood before I had any other evidence that she had a baby. I told Dale that evening. He asked how certain I was. I told him I was as certain as I had been about anything I had seen in those 3 years, and that if I was wrong, I would be surprised. He was quiet for a while, turning it over. Then, "Well, that changes things." He was right. It changed them faster than either of us expected. The weeks between when I understood she was nursing and the morning of June 21st were among the strangest of my life on that property. Strange, not in a frightening way. Strange in the way of a period of suspended waiting when you know a thing is building and you cannot predict its shape, but you can feel its approach the way you can feel a front moving in from the Cascades before the clouds arrive, a pressure change in the air that says it is coming. She came to the fence every morning in that period, sometimes twice, dawn and dusk. She stood for longer than usual, 10 and 15 and sometimes 20 minutes at the posts where I left food. She was not eating, or not primarily. She was watching the house with a quality of attention that was different from anything I had tracked in 3 years of watching her watch us. I cannot describe it precisely without risking making it sound more human than it was. But there was a directed quality to it, a focusing as if she was building a decision the way you build a fence, one post at a time, checking the tension of each wire before you move to the next. Dale noticed it on the morning of June 18th. He came to the kitchen at 5:40 and stood at the window without speaking and watched her standing at the fence post in the morning light. After a few minutes, he said, "She's deciding something." I told him I'd been thinking the same thing for 2 weeks. He asked what she was deciding. I told him I thought she was deciding whether to show us. He was quiet. The cattle in the lower pasture moved toward the water tank. The figure at the fence did not move. "What happens if she decides yes?" he asked. I told him I didn't know, that I thought we needed to be ready for whatever it was. He went back to his coffee. A few minutes later, he said, "Ready how?" I told him, "Go slow, stay where you are, don't frighten her and don't rush her. If she brings the baby to the fence, let her set the terms of it. Be what she has spent 3 years deciding we are." He nodded. That was a language he understood. You do not manage a nervous animal by advancing. You hold your ground, you breathe, you let the animal make the approach when it is ready. You earn the advance by being still enough that your stillness becomes a kind of reassurance. On June 19th, she came at dawn with the baby visible against her chest. She came to the fence post and stood for about 12 minutes and then went back to the timber. She did not put the baby down. She looked at the house with that building focus quality, and she stayed for 12 minutes and she left. On June 20th, she did not come at all. On the morning of June 21st, 1994, I was at the window at 5:45. The morning of the 21st of June, 1994, was clear and cool, around 48 degrees at sunrise, with a light wind coming from the northwest that carried the smell of the ponderosa in from the forest. I was at the kitchen window with my coffee at 5:45 when she came out of the timber. She came directly from the tree line to the fence post, which was not her usual pattern. Her usual approach was along the edge of the timber, moving through the shadows at the tree line and then gradually drifting closer to the fence. This morning she came out into the open immediately, walking quickly with her head up, and she was carrying the baby against her chest. I had the binoculars up before she reached the fence. The baby was large for a newborn, or what I was estimating as a newborn, based on the size relative to her body. It was covered in dark hair, darker than hers, and it was pressed against her chest with both of her arms wrapped around it. She carried it as I have seen human mothers carry infants, upright against the body, the small head tucked under her chin. She walked to the fence post that I had been leaving food at for 2 years. She stopped there. She stood for a moment with the baby held against her. And then, with a care that stopped my breath, she bent and placed the baby on the ground at the base of the fence post. On the human side of the fence, she put her baby on our side of the fence. She straightened to her full height. She took 3 steps backward toward the tree line, and she stopped. She put her hands at her sides, and she watched our house. I am 70 years old, and I have lived long enough to understand that some moments cannot be reconstructed after the fact without losing what was essential in them. What I can tell you is what I saw in the posture and position of what stood at my north fence that morning. She had put her baby down and stepped back, not abandonment, presentation. She was showing me something. She was doing what you do when you hold something out to another person so they can see it clearly. She had placed her baby in the only neutral space that existed between us, and she was standing back and watching to see what I would do. The baby made no sound at first. It was on its back, or what I took to be its back, and its arms were moving in that loose, uncoordinated way that very young things move their arms, not yet in control of their own reach. The grass was wet with dew at the base of the fence post, and the morning was cold, and the baby was on the cold ground, and I had maybe 30 seconds of standing at the kitchen window trying to understand what was being asked of me before I put down my coffee cup and went to the back door. I went out without my coat. I am not sure why. I walked across the north pasture in my wool socks and my flannel robe, and the dew soaked through immediately, and the cold came up through the soles of my feet, and none of it registered because I was walking toward the fence post and the thing at the base of it, and behind the fence post at 3 steps distance, the mother was standing completely still and watching every step I took. I stopped at the fence. The baby was on its back in the grass looking up. Its eyes were open. They were dark, a very deep brown, and they were the most alert eyes I have ever seen in anything that young. It turned its head and looked at me. I looked back. It was perhaps 3 weeks old, maybe 4. Its face had the broad structure of its mother's, but smaller, with a flatter nose and heavier brow already forming. Its hair was dense and fine, almost like the coat of a very young deer. Its hands were visible above its chest, and I could see, even from a standing position, that they were large relative to the rest of it. I looked at the mother. She had not moved. She was watching me with an expression I could not fully read at that distance and in that low light, but in her body there was a tension that was not aggression, a held breath quality, as you wait when you have just done an act that cannot be undone, and you are waiting to see what comes of it. I looked back at the baby. I crouched down so that we were at the same level on opposite sides of the fence wire. The baby tracked my movement and continued looking at me with those dark, aware eyes, and then I understood what she was asking, not in words, not in any system of communication I had been trained to use, in the language of a mother who needed someone to look at what she had and confirm that it was real and that it was good. She had been alone with this for weeks, maybe longer if the pregnancy was difficult, and the forest offered nothing that was capable of the particular acknowledgement she needed. She had spent 3 years at my fence line. She had learned what I was. She had made a calculation about me that I will never be able to verify or question, a calculation that said, this one can be trusted with what matters most. I put my hand through the fence wire, flat and open, palm up, as you offer your hand to an animal you want to settle. I did not try to touch the baby. I just put my hand down in the grass a few inches from it, open and still, and I waited. The baby turned its head and looked at my hand. Its own hand, small as it was, moved in that uncoordinated reaching way. The fingers found my palm. They were warm, much warmer than the morning air, radiating a heat that was out of proportion to their size, like holding a small stone that has been sitting in the sun all afternoon. The grip, when it closed around my index finger, was careful and considered in a way I would not have expected from something that young, not the reflexive grasp of a human infant. Something with more intention in it, though I am cautious about that word. I stayed crouched at the fence with the baby's hand around my finger for what I estimate was about 2 minutes. During those 2 minutes, the mother did not move. The cattle in the lower pasture were quiet. The wind had died. The only sounds were the creek in the draw to the east and the birds beginning their morning in the timber, and underneath all of it, a faint low vocalization from the mother that was so quiet I was not sure at first I was hearing it, a steady murmur just above the threshold of human perception that I felt more in my sternum than heard with my ears. She was talking to the baby, reassuring it, telling it in whatever language she had that this was all right, that I was all right. I gently freed my finger from the baby's grip. I stood, I looked at the mother for a long moment. Then I did something I had never in my life done before and have not done since. I nodded, not a greeting nod, a nod that was an answer to the question she had been standing there asking. I see it. It is beautiful. I understand what you have shown me. She held her position for another few seconds. Then she came forward, 3 steps back to the fence post, and gathered the baby from the ground with a movement so smooth and careful that I stepped back without thinking. And in a handful of seconds, she had the baby against her chest again and was turning toward the tree line, and she walked back into the forest and was gone. I stood at the fence post with wet socks and dew soaking through my robe and my heart going faster than it had any right to. And I looked at the place in the grass where the baby had lain, and where the ground still showed the slight depression of its weight. Then I walked back to the house and sat at the kitchen table and cried, not from fear, not from shock exactly, from what had just been given to me, which was trust in a form I had never encountered before, and which I understood, even in those first minutes, came with a responsibility I had not asked for and was not sure I deserved. Dale found me still at the table when he came downstairs at 6:30. He looked at my face and at my wet robe and at the expression I must have been wearing, and he sat down across from me without asking anything. I told him what had happened. He listened all the way through without speaking, as he always did with things that required his full attention. When I finished, he reached across the table and put his hand over mine. He said, "She showed you the baby?" I said yes. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "She's been watching us for 3 years. She knows who we are. She decided to show you the baby." He paused. That means something, Donna. I don't know exactly what, but that means something. It did mean something. I spent the next several months trying to understand what, and the understanding came in pieces, as understanding does when you are dealing with something that does not fit inside the boxes you already have. Kevin was up before I had finished telling Dale. He had heard me moving through the house at 6 and come down to find me at the table. He heard the end of what I said enough to understand what had happened, and he stood in the kitchen doorway for a long time with his face working through a series of expressions too fast for me to follow. She trusts you, Kevin said, the way teenagers sometimes cut to the center of a thing without the circling that adults do around the difficult parts. Wayne came down at 7 and we told him. He asked if the baby was all right. I told him it had seemed healthy and warm and alert. He asked if he could see it. I told him I didn't know. That was entirely up to the mother. Over the course of that summer, I saw the baby at the fence 4 more times, always in the morning, always in that same section of fence, always with the mother. The mother's behavior had shifted in a way that I noticed, and Dale noticed, and even Kevin noticed. She was calmer at the fence line. Less of the pacing that had marked the weeks before the birth. She came more slowly with the baby against her, and she stood at the fence for longer stretches, and she watched the house with an attention that felt different from before. Less guarded, not trusting exactly, or not only that, more settled, the comfort of a decision already made. The baby was growing. By August, it was visibly larger than it had been in June, growing at a rate that seemed faster than a human infant would, though I was aware that I had no baseline for this and was comparing it to my own son's baby photographs, which was not a reliable metric. By September, when I could see it more clearly in the early morning light, it was holding its head up and looking around on its own, and once I watched it make a grab for the fence wire with its hand, a reach that the mother redirected with a gentle press of her palm before the small fingers could close on the metal. She didn't want the baby touching the fence. She didn't want it reaching for the human side of things. That single small correction told me a fact I have thought about many times since. She was showing me the baby. She was not bringing the baby to me. The distinction mattered. The fence was the line, and she knew it as well as I did. There was a moment in late September of that year that I think of most often when I try to locate the center of this story. She came in the early morning, the baby slung against her back now, old enough for that carry, and she came to the fence post and stood. I was at the window. The light was thin and gold in the particular way of September mornings when the larch had just starting to turn. The baby had its head up looking around, and for a moment it looked directly at the house, at the window where I was standing, and in that moment she looked at me, and I looked at her, and the baby was between us looking at the house, and what I felt was not wonder, or not only wonder. It was older and simpler than wonder. It was the recognition of shared condition. We were both mothers standing in the early morning light with everything we valued most in the world nearby, and the thing that separated us was a wire fence on land neither of us had made. I did not know yet that the harder part was still ahead. I did not know yet what it would mean to keep this secret, or what keeping it would cost, or how far some people in my own family would push against my decision. I did not know yet what she would do in the winter of that year, or what the baby would eventually become, or what Dale and I would spend the next 25 years learning and protecting and never speaking of outside our own walls. What I knew, standing at that window in September of 1994, with the larch going gold on the ridge and a mother and child at my fence post, was that a trust had been extended to me across a distance I had no language for, and I intended to be worthy of it. What came next tested that intention in ways I had not anticipated. Wayne turned 13 in November of 1994, and the change was the kind that hit some boys hard and fast. Taller, broader, suddenly interested in things that had not interested him before, and more insistent about those interests than a 10-year-old would have been. He had been patient and careful with what we were all carrying, more patient than most children could have managed. But a change took hold in him that fall, and it had a direction. He wanted to tell someone, not his friends, not initially. He wanted to tell Tom Garfield, our vet whom he had always liked and trusted, and who Wayne knew had his own history of odd encounters in the Colville National Forest. He brought it up at dinner in early December in the measured way he had of introducing things he had already thought through. Tom ought to know, he said, because Tom was already halfway there on his own and having someone else who could document things properly might be important later. Dale and I looked at each other over the table. Kevin, who was 16, kept his eyes on his plate. I told Wayne I understood why he felt that way. Then I told him why we had chosen not to tell anyone and why I still felt that was the right choice. What I said was not dramatic, it was practical. I told him that once information like this goes beyond our family, we cannot control where it goes next. Tom was a good man and a careful one, but Tom had colleagues, and colleagues had their own ideas about what ought to be done with a thing this significant. I explained that the state and federal wildlife agencies had jurisdiction over the Colville National Forest that bordered our property, and that any documented evidence of an unknown species on or adjacent to our land would immediately be their business to manage, not ours. I told him I did not trust institutions, not because I thought the people in them were bad, but because institutions respond to their own logic, which is about documentation and protocol and precedent, and none of that logic had any room in it for the kind of quiet that this family needed. Wayne pointed out that we were making a decision for her too, and he wasn't sure we had that right. I sat with that for a moment. He was 13, and he was not wrong. I told him he was right, that we were making a decision that affected her. I told him I had thought about that since June, since the morning she put the baby down at the fence post and stepped back. I said that what I believed, based on 3.5 years of watching her behavior on this property, was that she had made her own calculation about this boundary. She came to our fence line because she chose to. She approached the house because she chose to. She showed me the baby because she chose to. Every one of those things was a choice made by a being that understood what the consequences of exposure would be, or understood it well enough to remain consistent in the behavior of staying hidden from everything except us. The fact that she had chosen to let us see her, and only us, over 3.5 years, without ever going further, without ever approaching the house or the barn or coming into the yard, was itself a statement about what she wanted the arrangement to be. I believed she had chosen us specifically because we had not responded to her presence by calling anyone. We had watched and been still and left food and not escalated. If we escalated now, after all of that, I thought we would be breaking the only agreement we had ever made with her, the one made without words by behavior over time. Wayne was quiet through all of this. When I finished, he asked if I was sure she understood what our silence meant to her safety. I said I wasn't sure of anything except what the evidence showed, which was that she had been living in those mountains for at least 4 years that we knew of, and in all that time she had remained undetected by anyone other than us, and that the only way to account for that, given how often she came to our fence line, was that she was exercising a level of awareness about human perception that I was not comfortable dismissing. Kevin looked up from his plate. She knows what a truck sounds like from 2 miles away. She knew every time Dad drove the fence line in the truck, and she cleared out every time. She's not careless. That was the last significant push Wayne made toward telling someone, not because he fully agreed with us. I think he spent years in some part of him that remained unconvinced, and the years would bring that tension back in different forms. But that night at the table, he accepted the decision. The winter of 1994 into 95 was mild by Kettle Range standards. The heavy snows did not come until January, and the fence line at the north pasture stayed accessible for most of December. She came less often in the cold, which was consistent with the pattern we had seen the previous 2 winters. The baby, when I saw it, was bundled somehow into the carry she used, tucked close to her body for warmth, and I could see from the house that she held it differently, the baby now more of an active participant in the carry, gripping with its own hands rather than simply being held. The food exchanges continued through that winter. I left dried apples, dried corn, smoked venison. She left things in return. A cluster of red berries I didn't recognize that Dale identified as kinnikinick, a plant that the local deer ate, but that I hadn't thought of as a food source in that context. A small bundle of dried leaves bound with grass that smelled strongly of medicinal properties, a piece of obsidian napped to an edge that I examined and could not account for because there was no obsidian source I knew of in the Kettle Range country, which is not volcanic geology. The nearest obsidian sources were on the other side of the Cascades or down south toward the Oregon border. The obsidian troubled me, not in a bad way. in the manner of evidence that says a thing is bigger than you thought it was. If she was carrying obsidian or had access to trade networks that brought it to her, or had a range that extended to volcanic country on the other side of the mountains, then what I was seeing at my fence line was not the full picture of her life. It was the edge of it, the part she had chosen to let me see. I put the obsidian piece on the kitchen windowsill next to the branch with the groove. I spent the winter of '94 into '95 thinking about those objects more than I would have predicted, not obsessively, steadily. The way you think about a passage in a book that you have read and closed but which will not quite leave you alone. The three objects on that windowsill were the most articulate thing about the whole arrangement, more articulate than the tracks or the fence damage or even the vocalizations at night, because they had been placed, not left by accident, not dropped in the course of some other activity. They had been brought to the fence post and placed there in the way you place a thing you want another person to find. That meant something had gone to the effort of bringing them. The obsidian had come from somewhere the Kettle Range geology did not produce. Someone had carried it here, or had had it, and had chosen to leave it for me. Either way, the choice to leave it said more than the object itself. It said, I have things you have never seen before. I am offering you a view of the portion of my life that does not show at your fence. I showed the obsidian to Tom Garfield in January when he came out to check on one of our older cows. Tom was a careful man with scientific leanings, and I trusted his eye. He turned the piece in his hands and looked at the edge and said it had been knapped, which I already knew, and that the nearest obsidian sources he was aware of were west of the Cascades or well down into Oregon, which was what had troubled me. He asked where I had found it. I told him I had found it near the north fence. He looked at me for a moment and then handed it back and asked no further questions, which was the specific kind of courtesy I had come to value in Tom Garfield more than almost anything else. Dale held the obsidian the night I told him where I was going with my thinking about it. He turned it in his hands the way he held anything he was working through with his mind, using his hands to help the processing. Then he set it down and looked at the windowsill where all three objects sat. He said, she's been doing this a long time, not just with us, long before us. I asked him what he meant. He said that the obsidian implied travel or trade or a range much larger than what we were observing. And a being with a range that large had been moving through human-occupied country, had been adjacent to human activity for as long as that country had been human-occupied, which in northeastern Washington was a very long time. She knew how to do this. She had been doing it in some form through many generations of her own kind and through many generations of the people who had occupied these mountains. We were not unique. We were just the current iteration of an arrangement that was older than either of us could fully imagine. I sat with that for a long while. The word arrangement kept returning to me. Not accident, not random proximity, an arrangement, a way of living close to each other that both parties had decided was acceptable and had maintained through whatever pressures the world brought. In the spring of 1995, the baby came to the fence on its own legs for the first time. The mother was still present, close, but the baby walked at what I was estimating as 9 or 10 months old on 2 legs, steadily and with balance that struck me as advanced, even accounting for how different the developmental timeline might be. It was broader and sturdier than a human infant walking at 9 months, lower to the ground with a stance that reminded me of young animals settling their weight when they are learning the ground beneath their feet. Its hair had darkened since June and thickened, and in the morning light I could see that it was going to be built like its mother. Wide through the chest and shoulders with those long arms and broad hands, the baby looked at the house. It looked at the house as the mother had looked at the house for 3 years, with the attentive, held quality of something that is actively gathering information. And then, under the mother's watchful presence, it put one hand on the fence wire, not gripping, just touching, feeling the metal. The mother made a sound, low and brief, the same sound she had made when the baby reached for the wire the previous fall. The baby withdrew its hand. It looked at the mother. She made another sound. The baby put its hand down in the grass and looked at the house for another moment, and then they both turned and walked back toward the timber. 30 feet from the tree line, the baby looked back once. It looked at the house. It might have been looking at anything, but it looked back. The summer of 1995 brought a problem I had not prepared for. which was that word was starting to travel. Not about us, not about our specific property, but through the broader community of Ferry County and the smaller communities of the Kettle Range country, there was a shifting current of talk about something in the Colville National Forest. People who ran cattle adjacent to the National Forest were sharing stories. A rancher on the Curlew Lake side had found tracks in his upper pasture. A family running a small operation near Malo had reported sounds they couldn't account for. Tom Garfield came to our place in August with the manner of a man who had been doing a lot of thinking, and he and Dale sat on the porch for 2 hours while I found things to do near the window. Tom had been comparing notes with other people in the county, and there was a consistent pattern. The activity was concentrated in the eastern Kettle Range, in the forest between Highway 21 to the east and the Kettle Crest Trail to the west. He was starting to think there was more than one individual, based on the geographic spread of the reports. He had been in contact with a researcher at Washington State University in Pullman who wanted to send a graduate student to the area to do a survey. Dale told him we had nothing to report from our property. He said this with the straightforward ease of a man who had told that particular truth before and was comfortable with it, which made it true in the way that all partial truths are true. We had nothing to report. We had chosen not to report it. Tom looked at Dale for a long moment. Then he looked at the house, at the kitchen window where I was visible, then back at Dale. He said, "All right, Dale." He left his card in case we changed our minds. We did not change our minds. We had the conversation that evening about weather too, and we reached the same conclusion we had reached the previous winter with Wayne, but with more data and more certainty. The WSU researcher and his graduate student came to the Kettle Range that fall and spent 3 weeks in the National Forest and found 2 sets of tracks, some ambiguous sounds on a recording device, and nothing confirmable. They wrote a report that I later read through a copy Tom gave Dale. The report put the evidence as inconclusive but suggestive. It recommended further investigation. The investigation was never funded. What the researcher had not found and could not have found was what was on our property. What was on our property was an ongoing relationship between a rancher's family and a mother and child who had chosen their particular fence line. That was not something a graduate student with recording equipment could have found in 3 weeks in the National Forest, because it was not happening in the National Forest. It was happening in the space between the National Forest and a cattle ranch, in the thin margin of trust that had been built one morning at a time over 4 years of careful distance and practiced stillness. The baby grew. By 1996, it was the size of a large human 5-year-old, though it carried that size differently, more forward through the shoulders with a low center of gravity and a quietness in its movement that its mother had clearly taught it. I rarely heard it make sounds at the fence line. When it did, they were brief and low, below the range where the cattle paid attention to them. It watched the house as its mother had watched. I had the persistent feeling, which I never entirely shook, that they were paying attention to the details of our lives in a way that had an intelligence behind it. The trucks that came and went, the schedules of the boys, the times I was in the garden versus the times I was in the barn. The rhythm of our operation, learned and tracked with a patience that suggested a mind capable of pattern recognition. In the fall of 1996, Kevin left for Washington State University in Pullman, and the house changed as a house changes when a child leaves it for the first time. Not emptier exactly, different in its sounds and its rhythms. Wayne was 15 and still at home, and Dale and I reorganized the chores as you do when your workforce shifts. The night before Kevin left, he sat with Dale and me on the porch after dinner, and he said something I think about when I miss him. "She is going to notice when my truck is gone," he said, with a seriousness that showed he had been paying attention not just to what he could see at the fence line, but to what he imagined might be noticed about us from the tree line. "She knows our trucks," he said. "She knows who drives which one. She knows Kevin's truck." And then he grinned, which was a Kevin grin, sideways and quick, and he asked, "Do you think she'll wonder where I went?" I told him I had no idea, but that I thought she probably noticed everything. He drove away the next morning before dawn, and I stood at the kitchen window and watched the north pasture and thought about whether she was out there in the dark timber watching the lights of his truck go down the county road. I thought about the intelligence that had been watching us for 5 years, The mother who had made 1,000 small calculations about our family, who knew the sound of our engines and the schedule of our days and the shape of us against the windows of our house. I thought about what it meant to be known in that way by something that could not tell you it was paying attention. She came the following morning alone without the young one. This was unusual. She stood at the fence post for about 15 minutes, and in the binoculars she was looking at the house with the same attentive quality as always, but there was something in her posture that I had come to associate with a kind of inquiry. The tilt of her head, the direction of her gaze. She was reading the house, checking its composition. When she left, she walked back to the tree line more slowly than usual, pausing twice to look back. I have never been comfortable making definitive claims about what any animal thinks or feels. I am a rancher, not a scientist, and I have spent my life watching animals and being careful about the stories I tell myself about what their behavior means. But I have also spent 30 years as a mother, and I know what it looks like when a large, intelligent, observant being takes stock of a change in its environment and decides how to respond. She noticed. The winter of 1996 into 97 was the hardest winter the Kettle Range had seen in a decade. Snow started in November and did not let up until March. We lost 2 cows to a fence failure in January when a drift covered the top wire and a group pushed through. The county road to our property was impassable for 11 days in February, and Dale made a fuel run by snowmobile the week of Valentine's Day because we were burning through propane faster than we had budgeted for. It was the kind of winter that reminds you why your grandparents built root cellars and kept more wood than they thought they needed. The visits to the fence line stopped with the first deep snow, the way they always did. By February, the north pasture was under 3 feet of drift, and the fence post where she usually stood was buried to the 3rd wire. I did not worry about them. I had learned by then that the winters were a pause, not an ending. They were in the timber in whatever sheltered places they used through the cold months, and they would come back when the snow receded and the ground softened and the earliest wild plants pushed through at the margins of the snowbanks. The young one came back in April of 97 looking changed in ways that stopped me at the window. In the 3 years since the fence introduction, it had grown steadily, and I had tracked the growth as you track any regular thing you observe, marking the changes against what you already knew. But the winter had done an acceleration to the growth, or perhaps I had simply not seen the young one in close enough light recently to register the accumulation. It was big, not the mother's size, not yet, but large enough that standing beside her at the fence line it no longer looked like a child relative to her mass. It looked like a juvenile, a year or 2 from adult scale, with the breadth through the chest and shoulders that its mother had, and the same dense dark hair now carrying a slight reddish tint in strong light, a color I noted because I had been watching that hair for 3 years, and the reddish tone was new or newly visible. It also moved differently than it had moved the previous fall. There was less of the exploratory uncertainty that marks the gait of a growing thing that is still calibrating itself to the ground. It moved with a settled confidence that told me the winter had not been an interruption in its development, but an acceleration of it. That spring and summer, the visits to the fence took on a quality I had not experienced before. The young one began standing at the fence independently without the mother directly beside it. Not far from her, never more than 10 or 15 feet, but on its own. It would stand at the fence and look at the house and then look back at its mother and then look at the house again. And what I saw in that back and forth had the quality of a young thing checking its own assessment against a more experienced one, learning to read what it was looking at. And it was looking at me, not at the house in the abstract, at the woman in the kitchen window who was visible to it as a specific shape in a specific location at a consistent time of day. I understood this because of an afternoon in July when I was late coming to the window, delayed by a phone call, and I watched the young one turn from the fence and look directly at the kitchen window with an expectant quality, and then turn back to the fence and wait. When I finally appeared at the window, it turned and looked at me again in a way that was not random. It had expected me to be there, and I had been late, and it had waited. I raised my hand at the window, a small gesture. I had never done that before. It was not planned. The young one looked at me for a long moment, then it looked at its mother, then it looked back at me, then it turned and they walked toward the tree line. But before the young one reached the timber, it looked back at the window one more time, and it raised its arm. It raised its arm. Not a human gesture. The elbow angle was different, and the hand position was not the wave I had made, but it was a raised arm directed at me after I had raised mine. Call and response, imitation, acknowledgement. I had made a gesture and it had answered it, and I stood at my kitchen window in July of 1997 with my hand still slightly raised, and I understood that whatever the relationship between our two families was, it had just moved into territory I had no map for. I did not tell Dale that evening. I told him the next morning over coffee, and I watched his face, as I always watched his face when I was telling him a thing that required him to expand his understanding. He listened. He was quiet. He refilled his coffee cup. Well, what do you do with that? I told him I didn't know yet. He nodded slowly. I think the young one is going to keep coming back here, Donna, long after it's grown. I think this is going to be a long-term thing. I told him I thought he was right. Then we need to decide what we're going to do when the boys have their own families, when there are grandchildren here, when the property changes hands. It was not a conversation I had been ready to have, but he was right to start it. What we had been doing for 6 years was not a temporary situation. It was a way of living. It was an ongoing commitment that we had made, however informally, to a set of beings who had chosen us and who had built a connection with us that neither party had names for. That commitment was going to outlast the current arrangement, and the current arrangement had no documentation, no formal understanding, no guarantee beyond the daily practice of keeping what we knew inside our own walls. Dale said, Kevin needs to know the full weight of it before he brings someone home. I agreed. Kevin came home at Christmas. We told him the full history, including the July moment with the raised arm, and we told him that Dale's belief was that the relationship would continue long past when Dale and I were the ones maintaining it. Kevin listened with the attentiveness he had always brought to anything involving the North Pasture, and when we finished, he sat for a long moment and then said, You're telling me that if I eventually own this place and bring a family here, they will already know us. They will already know who we are before we move in. I said that was what the evidence suggested. He said, Nah, that's a lot to put on a family that doesn't know it yet. I said, yes, it was. He thought about it through the holidays. The day before he drove back to Pullman, he found me in the barn, and he had made a decision. He told me that when the time came, he would tell the person he brought home before they came here. He would not bring anyone to the ranch who didn't know what was on the property. He said he thought that was the only honest way to do it. He owed that to the family on the other side of the fence as much as to whoever he married. He was 20 years old, and he was wiser than most people twice that age, and I have been grateful for that wisdom many times since. The years between 1997 and 2003 were the quiet middle of this story. Not quiet in the sense that nothing happened. The relationship continued to develop in ways I tracked carefully and which I will describe in a moment. But they were quiet in the sense that the acute anxiety of the early years, the question of whether to tell someone, the tension of managing the boy's understanding, the fear of discovery had settled into a practiced awareness. We knew what was on our property. We knew what our obligations were. We had made our choices, and we were living them, and the living of them had become, if not ordinary, then at least part of the ordinary rhythm of our days. What was not ordinary, and what never became ordinary, no matter how long we lived with it, was the ongoing development of the young one. By 2000, it was large, significantly larger than its mother, who herself stood well over 7 feet by my estimate. It had come into its full adult size sometime in the late 1990s, and the scale of it at the fence line in the mornings was a quality that never stopped reaching into some primitive part of my brain and saying, This is a different order of being from you, and you know it, not in a way that generated fear. Fear had largely left this relationship sometime in 1995, replaced by more like the respectful awareness you carry in grizzly country, a form of attention that is not paranoia, but is not carelessness either. What mattered most was that the raised arm exchange in July of 97 had not been a one-time thing. The young one had continued it. not every morning, not with the mechanical regularity of a trained animal. Randomly, as communication is random when it had a purpose to the visit rather than because it had been conditioned to perform. I would raise my hand at the window, or Dale would, and sometimes there was an answering gesture from the fence line, sometimes there was not. The inconsistency was what made it feel real rather than trained. You cannot predict what a thinking being will do, and the young one's responses were unpredictable in ways that kept reminding us that what we were dealing with had its own intentions. By 2002, the young one was coming to the fence line alone. The mother was still present in the timber during these visits. We could tell by the behavior of our dogs, who had lived with the awareness of the fence line visitors for long enough that their response to them was a low alertness rather than alarm, and the alertness changed quality when the presence at the tree line changed. But the young one stood at the fence without the mother directly beside it for longer periods, sometimes for half an hour or more in the early morning light. It would stand and look at the house, sometimes at the garden, sometimes at the barn and the corrals. Once, memorably, it stood at the fence during a period when we were working cattle in the north end of the property, sorting and loading, and it watched the entire operation with what I can only describe as absorption, as a person watches a process they have never seen before and are trying to understand. Dale noticed the cattle sorting observation and came to me that evening with a look on his face that was partly amusement and partly a different quality. It was watching how we work, Dale noted. Not just watching the cattle, watching how we handle the cattle. He paused. I had the feeling it was filing that away. The intelligence behind those observations was not a comfortable thing to sit with all the time. It was one thing to accept the presence of these beings as a reality of our property. It was another to absorb the ongoing evidence that they were studying us with the same care and curiosity with which we were studying them, and that their capacity for observation was at least equal to ours and in some respects exceeded it. In the summer of 2003, the mother stopped coming to the fence line. The young one came. The young one came every morning for 6 weeks, but the mother was absent, and after the 3rd week, I was certain the absence was not seasonal or temporary. The young one's behavior at the fence line had changed. There was a quality to its stillness that was different from its usual attentive watchfulness, subdued. A quality that I recognized without wanting to name it, because naming it would have required me to accept what I was not ready to accept. I told Dale in early August that I thought the mother was gone. He asked what I meant. I told him I thought she had died, or was dying, or had gone somewhere she was not coming back from. He sat with that for a long time. Then he said, "How old would she have been?" I told him I had no way to calculate it. We had first been aware of her in the summer of 1991, and she had been fully adult then. Beyond that, I could not estimate. He had read somewhere that the longevity of these beings was believed to be significantly greater than human longevity. I told him I had read the same things, but that what I was observing at the fence line did not look like the behavior of a young adult that had lost its parent. It looked like the behavior of a middle-aged being that had lost its mother. The young one kept coming, alone through the fall and into the winter, longer into the cold season than either of them had usually stayed visible. It stood at the fence in conditions that would have kept me inside in the early winter snow in temperatures that dropped below zero. It stood and looked at the house, and sometimes when I appeared at the window, it raised its arm and I raised mine, and we looked at each other across the north pasture in the winter morning light. In December of 2003, it left something at the fence post. Not the kind of things its mother had left, not food or a tool or a piece of stone, a handful of dark hair, coarse and dense, tied into a loose bundle with a strip of bark, laid carefully at the base of the post where the mother had placed her baby 9 years earlier. I stood at the fence post in the cold December morning, and I looked at that bundle for a long time. Then I picked it up. I carried it inside, and I put it on the kitchen windowsill with the branch and the obsidian, and I stood at the window and looked north. And somewhere in the timber, a sound came through the cold air that had no business being there in December, low and sustained and carrying something in it that I had no adequate word for. Grief. The word is grief. I am 70 years old, and I have lived long enough to know it in every form it takes, and what came through the cold air from the Colville National Forest in December of 2003 was grief. Not human grief, not performed or shaped for my benefit. The real thing. In the form available to the being that was carrying it, I put my hand on the window glass. I held it there for a minute. The glass was cold. Outside, the December morning was still, the north pasture white under snow, the tree line a dark seam against the pale sky. Somewhere in that timber a sound was continuing that had no name I was willing to put on it yet, though I knew the name. I held my hand on the glass until the cold came through my palm, and I let it because cold is real and grief is real, and the wall between the house and the forest was thinner in that moment than it had ever been in 12 years of watching from that window. I did not know yet how long it would stay that thin. I did not know yet that it would not fully thicken again. And then I went back to my morning. The years between 1997 and 2000 were a kind of education without a teacher, without curriculum, without any guarantee that what you were learning was the right interpretation of what you were seeing. That was the condition of it. No reference book, no one to call. Just the accumulated evidence of a relationship that had no precedent I could locate, and the discipline to keep watching without rushing toward conclusions. Kevin's departure for Pullman in the fall of '96 had changed the dynamic at the fence line in ways that confirmed a belief I had held quietly for years. She tracked individuals, not just the family in aggregate. She knew us separately, as you know the members of a household from their voices and their movements and how they inhabit a space. Kevin's truck had been part of the soundscape of our property for 2 years, and when it stopped appearing in the yard and on the county road, she noticed. Not in a way I could measure precisely, but in the quality of her attention at the fence in the weeks after he left, there was a checking quality that I recognized, an accounting for an absence. The young one by then was 3 years old if the timeline from June of '94 was right, and 3 years for a being with his growth rate put it at what I estimated was roughly equivalent to a human 8 or 9-year-old in developmental terms. Though I was cautious about that comparison. Human developmental timelines were the only framework I had, and the evidence was consistent enough that the young one was not developing on any human schedule. It was developing on its own schedule, which was faster in the physical dimensions and possibly different in other ways I lacked the instruments to measure. By the summer of '97, when the raised arm exchange happened, the young one was observant in a way that went beyond simple pattern recognition. It was testing things, not the fence itself, which it had stopped reaching for after the maternal correction in the spring of '95. It was testing responses. If it turned its head to one side while watching the house, it watched to see what I did. If it made a brief, low vocalization, it watched to see if anything in the house changed. It was conducting the same kind of incremental calibration that its mother had conducted in the early years, learning the household through repeated small observations. But where the mother had been cautious and measured in this process, the young one had a quality of directness that reminded me of how children approach new situations differently than adults. Less management of their own exposure, more direct reach toward what interested them. The raised arm exchange in July was not the end of the testing. It was the beginning of a different phase of it. Over the following fall, the young one began leaving things at the fence posts. The first was in September of '97, a flat piece of birch bark about the size of my hand. Nothing else, just the bark. I examined it and could not see anything intentional in it, which meant either there was a thing I was not equipped to perceive, or it was genuinely just a piece of bark, which was also possible. I left it where I found it. The next morning there was a second piece of bark beside it. By the third morning, I had 4 pieces of birch bark at the fence post, each slightly different in size. I lined them up on the kitchen table and looked at them and tried to understand what I was being told. They were not shaped or marked. They were not arranged at the post in any pattern. They were simply left, one per day, with a consistency that suggested intention rather than coincidence. I brought Dale to look at the collection. He turned each piece in his hands. "Is it possible she is leaving you a thing she uses?" he asked. I asked him what he meant. He said, "I don't know. In a winter camp, birch bark is useful. It waterproofs, it holds things, it burns, it makes containers. If she doesn't know what we use our materials for, maybe she's leaving us things she values," He paused. Or maybe she's leaving them because she watched you pick up the first one and she wanted to see what you'd do with more. That last possibility was the one that stayed with me. Testing? What did I do with the things she gave? What did the accumulation of a thing mean to me? Was I a being who responded to pattern? I went to the fence the following morning before the young one usually appeared, and I left the 4 pieces of bark in a neat stack at the base of the fence post. I arranged them squarely, with intention, so the arrangement was clearly purposeful. Then I went back to the house and watched. It came at its usual time 40 minutes later in the pre-dawn light. It went to the fence post. It looked at the stacked bark. It stood there for what felt like a very long time. Then it picked up the stack, looked at it, and looked at the house. It put the stack back down and walked to the tree line, where it turned once more before entering the timber. The following morning there was a stone at the fence post, a round river stone, smooth, about the size of my fist. This was not unusual. River stones were not abundant in that immediate area, which meant it had been carried, but how far I could not say. I left it. The next morning there were 2 stones, both round, both smooth, both about the same size. I went to the creek on our property and found 2 round stones of a similar size, carried them up to the fence, and placed them beside the 2 that had been left. The following morning, 6 stones, 8 the morning after that. We were counting. I was 90% sure we were counting. I carried this to Dale at breakfast that morning and told him what I had been doing over the past 2 weeks. He listened and then sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment the way he did when a matter required serious consideration. Then he said, "How high does it know how to go?" That was the question, wasn't it? And I did not have an answer. I left 10 stones the next morning. The morning after that, 10 were there when I arrived, so 12 total. I left 2 more. Morning after, 14. I left 2 more. Morning after, 16. I took 4 away. Morning after, 12 were there. We went back and forth this way for 3 weeks through the fall of 1997, adding and subtracting in a slow arithmetic that required patience I had not known I possessed, until the morning that I left 16 stones and came back to find 24. Not 18, 24, a jump of 8 from 16 with no intermediate step. I stood at the fence post in the October cold, looking at 24 smooth river stones lined up at the base of a fence post on my cattle ranch in northeastern Washington, and I felt a feeling I did not have a clean word for. Not awe exactly, though that was present. Not joy, though that was also there. Something more like the feeling having been in a conversation you didn't know you were having, and having the other party say a reply that went further than the conversation had gone before. I told Dale about the 24 that evening. He counted them himself when he went up to feed the north pasture cattle the following morning. Then he came back to the house. "Donna, that is not an animal." He meant it as the highest acknowledgment he could offer. He had spent 3 years being careful with his language, choosing words that left room for the possibility that what was on our property could be explained inside the existing categories of the natural world. 24 stones put an end to that caution for him. What he saw in 24 stones was the same thing I saw, a mind that was doing a capacity with quantity that went beyond the simple counting most animals are capable of. It had doubled the count. It had done arithmetic. That winter, I kept the stones on the kitchen windowsill in a row next to the branch and the obsidian and the bundle of hair that would not come for another 6 years. Wayne, who was 16 and home for Christmas that year, counted them when he saw them and looked at me, and I told him the story. He sat with it for a long time. "She's teaching the young one how to communicate with you. That's what the stones are. She knows how you count because she's been watching you for 6 years. She knows you're a person who counts things, and she's teaching the young one to use your system." I looked at my 16-year-old son and did not argue with him. He was probably right. He was the same boy who had watched the north pasture before school every morning for 3 years, who had grown up with this as a thread in the fabric of his daily life, and who had had 6 more years than his brother Kevin to integrate what he was observing. He saw it more completely than Kevin or Dale or I did, the way a child who grows up speaking 2 languages perceives connections between them that native speakers of either cannot easily see. Kevin came home in May of '98 for the summer, and we all 3 boys and Dale together told Kevin about the stones. He sat at the kitchen table and listened and looked at the windowsill and then said, "She's using you as a bridge." He said it as you say a phrase that explains other things you have been wondering about, clicking the explanation into place. She's not trying to communicate with us. She's using us to communicate to the young one what communication looks like. We're the model. He looked at the stones. Counting is a human thing. She's showing the young one that humans count, and she's teaching the young one to count in our system so the young one knows how to reach us. Two 20-year-old brothers and their mother at a kitchen table in northeastern Washington, coming to the same conclusion their father had already reached, which was that what was happening at our fence line was not the behavior of an animal. It was the behavior of a teacher. I do not want to romanticize this. I am aware of the danger of that, of projecting onto what I cannot fully understand a set of values and intentions that come from my own culture and my own needs. But I am also aware that being overly cautious in the other direction, insisting that everything I observed had a simpler explanation, because the complex one required me to accept something that defied easy categorization, was its own form of distortion. What I had was evidence, consistent, documented, accumulated over 7 years, and the evidence showed that the mother had been doing something sustained and intentional with the young one's exposure to us, that the exposure had a pedagogical quality, and that the young one was developing capabilities it demonstrated at our fence line that were specifically oriented toward contact with humans. Make of that what you will. I made of it what I could. Keep showing up at the window every morning, keep leaving food at the post, keep the stones on the windowsill, and keep believing that whatever was happening between our two families was worth the care it required. The quiet that settled over that property after Wayne left for Cheney was different from any quiet I had known there. 46 years of constant motion of children and later grandchildren visiting, of Dale and the boys and their noise filling every room, and now it was just the two of us and the cattle and the land. I want to be honest about what that felt like, because the easy version is to say it was peaceful. The more accurate version is that it was vast, like stepping out of a house into open country after years of not quite realizing the walls were there. What I found in that vastness was time to watch, which I had always done but had never before done without a portion of my attention held in reserve for the next demand on it. In those first months of being genuinely alone on the property, my mornings at the kitchen window became something different from what they had been. They became intentional in a way that the years of raising children and running a household had not permitted. Not just glancing at the north pasture while the coffee brewed, actually sitting, actually watching, an hour sometimes or two before the day's work pulled me away. What I saw in those hours was more than I had seen in the busy years, not because anything new was happening at the fence line, because I was finally attending with my full mind. The way a photograph develops when you take it out of the chemicals too soon and the image is faint and you put it back in the solution and the details you missed come through. What came through in those early 2000s mornings was the degree to which the young one had been watching us right back. Not passively, not the way a deer watches a field it grazes in without processing the field as anything but forage. This was active observation, the kind that stores and compares and draws inferences. When I moved from one window to another, the figure at the fence turned its head to track me. When Dale came downstairs early, the posture at the fence shifted in a way that acknowledged a change in the composition of the house. When the cattle moved in the far pasture, the figure's gaze moved to them and back to the house in a sequence that suggested it was connecting my relationship to the cattle with its own understanding of what the cattle represented to us. I began keeping a second journal in 2001, not the observation notes I had been making in the first journal since the early 90s. A different kind of writing, an attempt to put into language what it felt like to be in a decades-long relationship with a being I could not speak to, could not ask questions of, could not reach through any of the channels that human relationships use to carry meaning. What I wrote in that second journal was not science. It was closer to what a person writes in the margins of a book they love, notes to themselves about what a passage means and why it matters and what it connects to in their own life. What I wrote over and over in slightly different language was this: she chose us because we were still, not passive, still. the particular kind of stillness that is the opposite of indifference, that is, in fact, a form of the most intense attentiveness, the attentiveness that does not reach or demand or impose itself, but simply receives. She had been watching humans in these mountains for long enough, I believed, to have learned the difference between the humans who went still because they were frightened and the humans who went still because they were paying attention. We were the second kind. And that, as far as I could work it out, was why she had chosen our fence line, our pasture, our kitchen window. The year 2000 brought a change I had not anticipated. Wayne graduated from high school that spring and enrolled at Eastern Washington University in Cheney, and for the first time in 22 years of marriage, Dale and I were alone on the property. No children underfoot, no trucks coming and going for school. The rhythms of the house changed down to its simplest form, just us and the operation and the land. And in that new quiet, I noticed things I had been too busy to fully attend to before. One of them was how much the young one had grown in the past year. At 6 years by my calendar, it was approaching what I estimated to be adolescent scale, not full adult height yet, but moving toward it with the accelerated pace that had characterized its development all along. Its face was changing as faces change during adolescence, the bone structure setting into a settled form, the features becoming more defined. It had its mother's brow and its mother's breath through the chest, and in strong light in the mornings I could see the reddish overtone in its hair that I had first noticed in the spring of '97. It had stopped bringing stones. After December of '97, the counting game had wound down as gradually as it had begun, replaced by a different kind of attention at the fence line. The young one watched the house as it had always watched, with that absorbed attentiveness, but now it was also occasionally vocalizing in my direction, not the brief low sounds from before, longer sequences modulated in ways that had the rhythm of sentences, even if they carried no meaning I could access. I listened, I could not answer. But I listened, and I made sure it was visible to me at the window that I was listening, which seemed to be enough. The vocalizations continued. In 2001, September, Wayne called from Cheney 4 days after the attacks on New York and Washington. He was 20 years old and shaken, not from proximity to danger, but from the kind of shaking that happens to a young person when the world they understood turns out to have a different shape than they thought. We talked for a long time that night. At the end of the conversation, he said, "Mama, does it change anything out there at the fence in terms of what you think this all means?" I thought about it. Then I told him no. I told him that what was at our fence line was the evidence of a world that had been there before ours arrived and would be there after ours worked through whatever it needed to work through. I told him that one of the things I had learned from 7 years of watching the North Pasture was that the deepest currents run underneath the events that make the news, and that the deepest relationships are the ones that do not require the world's recognition to remain real. He was quiet for a moment, then he got to it directly. "That's why you've never told anyone, isn't it? Not just to protect her, but because what you have with her doesn't need anyone else to make it real." 20 years old, and he understood that in one conversation. I told him yes, that was exactly right. Kevin finished his degree at Pullman in '98 and had stayed in the Palouse country to work for an agricultural supply company based out of Colfax. He met his wife, Pam, at a church social in Colfax in 2000, and they married in 2002. Pam was from Ritzville, raised in wheat country, the daughter of a dryland farming family. She was quiet and capable and had the particular competence of women raised in isolated rural places, the kind of competence that knows how to get things done without a lot of infrastructure. Kevin brought her to the property for the first time in the fall of 2001, just the two of them, for a long weekend. He had done what he said he would do in the winter of '97 when he was 20. He had told her, not everything, not all at once, but enough. He had told her there was a thing on his family's property that he needed her to know about before she spent significant time there. He had told her what it was as well as he could in the telling. She came to the property for that first visit with the measured openness of a woman who had heard what she was seeing far outside her existing categories and was deciding what to do with the evidence of her own perception. She did not go to the window to watch. She did not ask to see tracks or photographs. She came and worked alongside Dale and me, as a person works when they are trying to understand a place by becoming part of its rhythms rather than interrogating it from outside. She mended fence on the second day. She helped Dale with a stuck gate on the third. On the last morning, she came to the kitchen at 5:30 and stood at the window beside me without asking, both of us with coffee, and we watched the north pasture together. She didn't appear that morning, or if she appeared, she was in the timber and not at the fence. But Pam stood at that window with me for 40 minutes in the pre-dawn dark, and at the end of it she looked at me. I can feel there's a presence out there. I can't see it, but I can feel it. Yes, I said. Some mornings were like that. Kevin told me, you have been watching this for 10 years, she said. I told her, closer to 11. She nodded slowly. Then, how do you keep a thing like this inside your own walls for 11 years? She asked. I told her you do it one morning at a time. You make the decision each morning to be worthy of what was extended to you, and after enough mornings it becomes who you are rather than what you are choosing. She nodded, as if that made complete sense to her, and I thought that Kevin had chosen well, and that whoever Pam turned out to be to this family, she was going to hold what she was given. Kevin and Pam moved to the property in 2004, the year after Dale turned 52, and began having the kind of winter that reminds you the body keeps score of what it has been asked to do. Not catastrophic, nothing diagnosed, just a tiredness that ran deeper than any single winter had any right to produce. We had been talking for a couple of years about what the next chapter of the operation looked like, and Kevin and Pam's move to the property answered part of that question. Kevin took over the day-to-day management of the cattle operation. Dale stayed in the work as long as he could do it comfortably and gradually shifted to the advisory role that is natural for a man who built a thing and is now watching someone he trusts carry it forward. The year they moved in, 2004, was also the year the young one began coming to the fence line with a consistency that had a different quality than in the years before. The mother was gone by then, had been gone since the summer of 2003, and the young one was alone. Its visits in the first year of its solitude had the subdued, searching quality I described before. By 2004, a shift had taken hold in those visits. The searching quality was gone. In its place was a settled routine that had the recognizable shape of a relationship maintained by intention rather than driven by need. It came to the fence because it chose to. That was the plain reading of what I observed. It had been coming to our fence line for 10 years, had learned us through 10 years of patient observation, and now that the mother was gone, the relationship with our household was its own thing. Not a substitute for the mother. For the mother, not dependence. A parallel thread existing alongside whatever life it was living in the forest, maintained with the same care the mother had always brought to her fence line visits. Kevin saw it clearly for the first time in the late spring of 2004. He had been awake early to check on a heifer that had calved the night before, and he was coming back from the barn at about 5:15 when he stopped on the path and saw the figure at the north fence. He had grown up knowing it was there, had seen it at the fence many times, but always at a certain distance, always through glass, always with the buffer of the house between himself and the north pasture. Standing in the open yard in the pre-dawn with nothing between him and the figure at the fence was different. He stood still. The young one at the fence looked at him. The distance was 150 yards, close enough to be unambiguous about what he was seeing, and for a few seconds neither of them moved. Then the young one turned its head slightly toward the house, toward the kitchen window where I was visible with my coffee, and then back to Kevin, a kind of triangulation. Kevin and I were both part of the same pattern it was observing. Kevin told me about it that morning over breakfast. The size of it had stopped him. He knew the scale intellectually, had seen the tracks and heard the history and seen it at the fence through the kitchen window many times. But seeing it in the open at 150 yards in the early morning light was different from knowing it. He said, "It looked at me, and then it looked at you, and I understood it was connecting us. It knows we're the same family." I told him yes. That was what I had believed for years. He asked me if it was safe to be in the open with it at that distance. I told him that in 13 years of this, nothing on our property had ever moved toward the house or toward any person in a way that felt aggressive or threatening. I told him the pattern was consistent. The fence was the line. I told him I had never felt in danger, which did not mean I had never been cautious, because those were different things. He nodded. He'd keep doing what he'd been doing, which was working the property without treating the fence line as a problem to be solved. He was a good choice to pass this too. I had known it for years, but watching him absorb that moment in the yard and integrate it into his understanding of his own land confirmed it. Pam began coming to the morning window within the first month of living there. She did not make a production of it. She simply began appearing in the kitchen at 5:30 with her coffee, as I did, and we watched together on the mornings when we were both up. She saw it twice in the first year and described both sightings to me afterward with a precision that told me she was paying the kind of attention that the situation warranted. No drama, no exaggeration, no interpretation beyond what the evidence showed. She saw a large bipedal figure covered in dark hair standing at the fence line. The figure was watching the house. The figure left when the light came up enough that it seemed to make a calculation about visibility. That was what Pam saw, and that was what she reported. After the second sighting, she told me, it knows the light schedule. It knows when there's enough ambient light that being at the fence changes what it is. During pre-dawn, it's just a shape. Once the sun is up enough to define what a shape is, the math changes. I told her she was the most perceptive person who had ever stood at that window with me. Kevin told me what you told him the year before we got married, she said, about making the decision to be worthy of what was extended to you. She paused. That's the thing I keep coming back to. She extended a trust to this family. She made a calculation about you, specifically about who you were, and she chose to show you her baby. And now it's our job to be who she thought you were. I thought about that for a long time. The burden of a trust that predated you, extended by a being who could not have predicted you would ever be part of the equation. The obligation of an inheritance you did not choose, but which defines the terms of your life on a particular piece of land. Yes, I told her. That was exactly it. Wayne came back to Ferry County in 2007 after a few years working in Spokane. He had married a woman named Cheryl in 2005, a teacher from Medical Lake who was gentle and curious and had been told what she was coming to before she came. Wayne brought her to the property the spring of 2007, and Cheryl stood at the kitchen window on her second morning and watched the figure at the fence for 22 minutes. When it turned and walked back to the timber, she said quietly, "It walks like it belongs to the ground in a way we don't." That was the most precise description I had heard from anyone. It walks like it belongs to the ground in a way we don't. Wayne and Cheryl settled in Republic, 12 miles from the property, and Wayne came to work the cattle operation alongside Kevin, as he had always been meant to do. The four of them, Kevin and Pam and Wayne and Cheryl, were the next generation of this arrangement, and watching them move into it together with the fullness of what they knew and the intention they brought to knowing it was one of the great satisfactions of my life on that land. Dale had a good decade through the 2000s. Not a spectacular one, not the dramatic health recovery that some people experience in their 60s, just a steady, settled, capable decade of a man doing what he had done all his life, working the land he grew up on, watching the family he had built take hold of it. He slowed down. We slowed down together. We fished the Sandpoil River in the summers and drove the back roads of the Kettle Range in the falls when the larch were golden and the light came in low and rich. We went to church in Republic and to the cafe on Main Street for coffee on Saturday mornings, and we grew old together as good marriages grow old, not losing each other but becoming more completely what they had always been. There were mornings in those years that I have kept with a care that surprises me when I locate them. Not dramatic mornings, not mornings on which something significant happened at the fence line or in the family or on the operation, just mornings. Dale at the window with his coffee before the light came up, both of us watching the north pasture in the pre-dawn dark, the cattle quiet and the forest dark and the property wrapped in the particular stillness of a place that is exactly what it has always been and is not pretending otherwise. He had a habit in those years of narrating small things, not to me specifically, to the air or to the property or to whatever part of himself needed the words said aloud. He would stand at the window and say, "Sandpoil's going to be running high with the snow melting," or That heifer in the north pen is going to calf before Wayne gets here. Or simply, watching the fence line. There she is. Just those 3 words, quiet and certain. There she is. The announcement of a presence that had been expected, whose appearance was a confirmation rather than a surprise. He said it the way you say good morning to someone whose arrival you have been counting on. I think about those 3 words often. They were the most accurate summary of what we had been doing for 15 years. There she is. The relationship in 3 words. We watch, she comes, there she is. The ordinary miracle of a commitment kept on both sides of a fence. He was more talkative with the young one than with the mother, which I found interesting and never directly asked him about. With the mother, he had always been reverent in a way that kept him quiet. With the young one, as it grew and began the raised arm exchanges and the extended vocalizations and the morning watches from the fence, he was more conversational. He would stand at the window and address it as you address a young person who is learning something you want to teach well. Good morning. Look at that frost on the north pasture. Cold one. The young one could not hear him through the glass, but the quality of his posture changed when he spoke, the same way the quality of anyone's posture changes when they are genuinely addressing someone, and I have always thought that posture carries more than words anyway, and that whatever was at the fence line in those years was reading us as much from our bodies as from our sounds. We grew into our 60s together, Dale and I, on the same land that had grown us into everything else. The operation ran well under Kevin's management, better in some respects than it had under ours because Kevin had the training and the equipment we had not had. In the early years, the herd was healthy, the leases were maintained, the fences were in better order than they had been since Dale's father's time. The land was doing what land does when people tend it well, persisting, recovering, holding what it holds. And at the north fence, in the pre-dawn dark, year by year, the figure came. He kept watching the north pasture every morning until the end of the years when he could get up at 5:30 without it costing him a significant effort, and then on the mornings when he could manage it. He tracked the young one's visits as he tracked everything else, quietly and consistently, noting the changes over time with the eye of a man who has spent his whole life reading an animal and reading a landscape, and understanding that reading is not a single act but a practice. In 2012, he told me that the young one's pattern had shifted again. The morning visits were still regular, but the duration had changed. It was staying longer, sometimes up to an hour in the early morning dark, standing at the fence or moving slowly along the fence line in that section of the north pasture. And the sounds were more frequent, not the brief exchanges of the early years, extended sequences, sometimes for 15 or 20 minutes, that moved through tonal variations I could not categorize. Dale thought it was talking, not to us exactly, to the land or to whatever it knew to be an earshot from that fence line. He said he thought the longer visits and the extended vocalizations were a thing it did at the fence line specifically, not in the timber. This fence line was the border of a relationship, and the relationship had become a relationship it was actively maintaining through behavior it directed at that specific location, not just at us, but at the place where the connection existed. I had stopped having the language for what to call what was between our household and the figure at the fence. Not a friendship exactly, not a protection arrangement, not a territory negotiation. Something older than any of those categories, a recognition between 2 kinds of beings that they were living close enough to each other to develop an understanding of the other's life. An arrangement that had begun with one mother showing another mother her baby and had become in 20 years a thread that ran through the daily fabric of 2 households on either side of a wire fence in the Kettle Range country of northeastern Washington state. Dale's diagnosis came in the fall of 2018. Lung cancer, which he had never smoked for, but which runs in his family, and which the specialists in Spokane told us had been developing for a while before it announced itself. He was 66. He was not a man who went quietly through difficult things. He was a man who went steadily through them, which is not the same. Steadiness is not passivity. It is active engagement with what cannot be changed, conducted without the drama that would waste energy you do not have to spare. He spent the fall and the early winter doing what he could do and not doing what he couldn't. And on the mornings when he was well enough, he was at the kitchen window at 5:30 with his coffee watching. The figure at the fence watched back, By then, Kevin and Pam and Wayne and Cheryl were sharing the morning watch rotation, but Dale's mornings were still his. Still, the particular quality of attention he had always brought to the north pasture, the rancher's eye that cataloged and compared and noticed. In December of 2018, about 3 weeks before Dale died, he said words to me at the window that I have replayed many times. We were watching the figure at the fence in the pre-dawn, a cold December morning, the north pasture white under new snow. The figure had come earlier than usual that morning while it was still full dark, and we had both gotten up when the dogs showed their quiet alert and come to the kitchen and stood at the window together in the dark with our coffee, two old people watching a fence line they had been watching together for 27 years, while outside in the cold a large and unknowable being stood at the post and looked at our lit windows. Dale was weaker by then than he had been in October, not visibly frail in the way of the very sick, more as if some quality of density had shifted, as if the gravitational pull of the man I had been standing next to for 46 years was operating at a slightly different setting. He stood straight, he held his coffee, he watched. After about 10 minutes, he said, "I have been watching that fence line for 27 years, and I have never been able to say what the right word is for what is happening there. And I have decided I am comfortable not having the word. The word is not the thing." I asked him what the thing was. "Knowing," he said, "just knowing. The mother showed you the baby because she wanted to be known by someone outside the forest. She wanted a witness. Not a scientist, not a researcher, not a government agency, just a person who would look and not forget." He paused. He was quiet in the way he was quiet when he was conserving energy, but not ready to stop. "I think that is the whole of it, Donna. She needed someone to know that they exist and to care about the knowing. Everything that has happened since is just the consequence of you being willing to be that person." He died on January 14th, 2019. Kevin and Pam and Wayne and Cheryl were there. I was there. He went quietly, which was the word I had told him would not be enough for what he was, but which was right in the end. The quiet was not the absence of an act, it was the completion of that act. The morning after Dale's funeral, I went to the kitchen at 5:30, habit or need or both. I stood at the window with my coffee. The figure was at the fence. It had been there by the time I reached the window long enough that the snow around the fence post was pressed down. It was standing still, looking at the house. Not at the kitchen window specifically, but at the house as a whole, the way it had stood, looking at the house for the first time I had ever seen it, in June of 1991 in the morning light. The same posture, the same held quality of attention. I stood at the window for 40 minutes. When I lifted my hand, it raised its arm in return. We held that for a moment, the two of us separated by the north pasture and the cold and the 28 years between that first morning and this one. Then it turned and walked back into the timber. I understood that this was its version of what I had done the morning after the burial, showing up, continuing, carrying the knowing forward. I live alone on the property now. Kevin and Pam are in the house with me, which is to say they are in the house, running the operation, and I am in my rooms with my kitchen and my window, which is what I need. The boys look after me with the particular care of children who have learned care from watching their parents practice it, and I look after the window. The figure still comes. Not every morning. It has its own life, its own season, its own demands on its time that I have never had a view of and cannot claim to understand. But it comes often enough that I have not had a stretch of more than 2 weeks without seeing it at the fence. And in 29 years of this, that record has held. Through every hard winter and every difficult season the land has put us through. It is not young anymore. I say that with care because I do not know how age registers in a being like this, do not know what the markers are or what they mean. But what I can see from the window at 5:30 in the morning is that the figure that stands at my fence is different from the small thing that put its hand on the fence wire in the spring of 1995. The body is fully adult in the sense that adults differ from juveniles in any species, a settled weight and solidity that comes not from size alone, but from the complete occupation of the frame. The movements have a quality I can only call earned, purposeful in the way that experience makes things purposeful, each motion the result of accumulated knowledge about what the ground will do and what the air holds. It knows me by sight at a distance that should make individual identification difficult. I know this because when Kevin or Pam stands at my window instead of me, the figure's behavior at the fence is different, more watchful, less settled. When it is me, there is a settling quality in the first minutes, a recognition acknowledged by a shift in posture that I have been watching long enough to read. This is the one I know. This is the house I come to. I have thought many times about what the mother understood when she walked out of that timber 30 years ago and set her baby at my fence post. She had watched us for 3 years before she did that. 3 years is enough time to understand a household's character. She knew who I was before she showed me what she had. She knew Dale. She knew the boys. She had made a calculation about us as a family, and the calculation had told her that we were the kind of people who could be trusted with the knowledge of what existed on the other side of that tree line, and who would not use that knowledge in ways that would cost her. She was right about that. We have not used it that way. We have kept it as she gave it to us, as a private knowing shared among the people on this specific piece of land, maintained with the care that anything worth having deserves. The question Wayne asked when he was 13, the question he never fully stopped asking, was whether we had the right to make that choice on her behalf, whether our silence was protection or appropriation, whether we were keeping her safe or keeping her secret for our own reasons. I have turned that question over for 29 years. I do not have a clean answer. What I have is the evidence of the relationship itself, which is the best evidence available. She has continued to come. For 30 years, she has had the choice to stop coming, to stay in the deep timber, to withdraw behind the tree line, and never return to the fence that marks the edge of our property. She has not made that choice. She comes. We watch. The arrangement continues. And in any relationship that has continued for 30 years without coercion on either side, the continuation is itself the answer. She comes because she chooses to. We watch because we choose to. The fence is still the line, and neither side has crossed it in the wrong direction. What she was asking that June morning in 1994 when she set her baby in the grass and stepped back was simpler and more complete than anything I was equipped to understand at 40 years old. She was not asking for help. She was not asking for intervention. She was asking for witness. Look at this. Know that it exists. Carry that knowing with care. I have tried. In the spring of this year, a morning in March, when the larch buds were just beginning to think about opening and the snow was retreating from the north pasture in patches, I stood at the kitchen window at 5:30 and watched it come out of the timber. It walked to the fence post. It stood in the pre-dawn cold and looked at the house. And then, after a few minutes, it did a thing I had never seen it do in all the years I had been watching. It sat down. At the base of the fence post, on our side of the fence, it sat in the wet March grass with its back against the post and its legs extended in front of it, and it looked at the house in the gray pre-dawn light, and it sat there for 30 minutes, not watching, not alerting, just sitting. I stood at the window and looked at this being that I had known for 30 years, this individual born to a mother who trusted me with her existence, this life that had grown up alongside my family's life on the same land, and I felt a feeling I did not try to name because some things do not need names to be real. What I felt was the weight of time and the lightness of it at once. 30 years is a long time to carry a secret. 30 years is also, I have learned, not nearly long enough to understand what you have been given. I am 70 years old, and I am still learning what that June morning in 1994 meant, and I expect I will be learning it until I run out of mornings to learn it on. I raised my hand at the window. It raised its arm. We sat like that for a little while. Then it stood, and it turned, and it walked back into the Colville National Forest the way it had walked into that forest every morning for 30 years, without hurry and without looking back. I set down my coffee cup. I looked out at the fence posts with the spring snow still white at its base. I thought about Dale at this same window. I thought about Kevin and Wayne learning to watch before they learned what they were watching for. I thought about Pam saying it walks like it belongs to the ground in a way we don't. I thought about the mother's 3 careful steps back and the baby on the cold June grass and my hand coming through the fence wire in an open palm. The Colville National Forest runs for over 1 million acres. It holds more than any survey has named, more than any trail map shows, more than any researcher who spent 3 weeks in it with a recording device could find. What lives in those trees has been living there since before there were names for those trees. And it will be living there long after the names are forgotten. It chose us. That is the plain truth of it. One morning in 1991, a being walked to the back fence of a cattle ranch in Ferry County, Washington, and began the long, careful work of deciding whether we were trustworthy. By 1994, it had its answer. By the morning of June 21st, 1994, the answer had become an act. I have kept what was given to me for 30 years. I will keep it until I cannot keep it, and then I will trust the people I have told to carry it forward the way I have carried it, the way Dale carried it. As Kevin and Pam and Wayne and Cheryl carry it, watching the north pasture in the pre-dawn quiet of a cattle ranch in northeastern Washington, doing the simple and costly and irreplaceable work of paying attention, the fence is still there. The tree line is still there. And in the dark before the sun comes over the ridge, when the frost is still on the grass and the cattle are quiet and the world has not yet required anything of you, it is still there, watching and knowing it is watched. That is the whole of it. That is everything she asked for. Quick,